On today's episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast with just Big Flip Livingstone, we're taking a look into what was a beautiful Stanley Cup finale for the Colorado Avalanche, finally lifting the Stanley Cup for guys like Nathan MacKinnon and Nazem Kadri and a lot more. There is a lot to talk about on today's show, my friends, and trust me when I say, you know I will be here to break it all down for you, including next season's updated Stanley Cup odds for the best team in the NHL. You know it's time to take a look at some bets. Lots more, including where do these two teams go? Tampa Bay, are they coming back? Colorado, can they run it back? Let's break it all down on today's episode, my friends.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on out there, everybody? And thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Just with Big Flip Livingstone today, subbing in for Steele like he did for me on yesterday's episode. And thank you guys for making us your first listen every single day. You can find us across all platforms you find your favorite and hottest content, and that includes YouTube. So please check us out everywhere you enjoy taking it in. Today's episode, my friends, we made it. It is the end of the NHL season. Of course, there are a lot of ways we could take today's episode, but I want to break it down from a perspective that I always look at things, a gambling perspective, but also one that takes a look at where do these two teams go from here. The Tampa Bay Lightning have a lot of their core coming back. Can they make another run to make it 4 Stanley Cup finals in a row? The Colorado Avalanche starting what could be a potential dynasty of their own with some beautiful pieces in place, including, of course, Cale Makar, Nathan MacKinnon, and others. But I also want to give you what I saw in Game 6. And also, we're going to wrap up the show with updated 2023 Stanley Cup odds. You know I'll be sprinkling some bets here, people. And thanks again for making us your first listen every single day. In terms of today's episode, let's get right into it. Game 6, there's something to be said about how the Colorado Avalanche got this done. And that's where I want to start today's episode, because we know the Colorado Avalanche have that offensive muscle that they can just flex at any time they want and really impose their offensive will on their opponents with the balanced attack that we saw all playoffs long. And kudos to the front office and Joe Sakic for adding pieces like Artturi Lehkonen, Nazem Kadri, Andrei Burakovsky over the last couple of seasons. Valeri Nichushkin for sure, obviously. These pieces really did step up in the clutch for the Colorado Avalanche and got it done. And let's start with Artturi Lehkonen, who scores a cup-winning goal. On top of putting them through, he won the series for them against Edmonton as well. That series-clinching goal. This guy, they paid a high price from Montreal. Joe Sakic hits it big with Artturi Lehkonen. A couple of absolutely massive goals for the forward who comes over from Montreal at the trade deadline and just absolutely is clutch all playoffs long. And what the Colorado Avalanche were able to do in Game 6 was be clutch defensively. They absolutely clamped down on the Tampa Bay Lightning's ability to get anything done offensively, and credit due to guys like Devon Taves and Cale Makar on the back end for stepping up, and bottom sixers like Darren Helm, Andre Cogliano for really pushing the pace at times, and of course, Nazem Kadri, Gabriel Landeskog, those guys up in the top 6, gumming up the works, making it difficult for the Tampa Bay Lightning to get settled. And, all kinds of credit is due to the Colorado Avalanche for really being able to hone in that defensive side of their game and hold the Tampa Bay Lightning to only 3 or 4 shots in the third period. I believe it was 3. That's all kinds of impressive, no matter how you break that down. because we know the offensive pieces that the Tampa Bay Lightning have had, despite missing players like Braden Point, and despite having a number of guys clearly dealing with injury. That's where I want to take this next is the Tampa Bay Lightning are the walking wounded going into last night's game. And that is really, I think, a point that was a difference here. And that's not to take away from anything that the Colorado Avalanche were able to accomplish. Let's make that very clear here. They are the deserving champs. That's not getting twisted at all in this solo episode, people. And thanks again for being here. But seriously, the Tampa Bay Lightning have played a lot of hockey over the last couple of seasons. It's been a talking point. We know this. More track record, more body count on this roster than any other team in the NHL, making it to 3 consecutive Stanley Cup finals is impressive. And those consecutive series wins by the Tampa Bay Lightning, it runs out at, I believe, you know me guys with the numbers here. Let me check these numbers for you. But the amount of consecutive series won by the Tampa Bay Lightning, 11 straight playoff series. Only 2 other teams have had more, and both of them are clear-cut dynasties in the New York Islanders and Montreal Canadiens in the late 70s and 80s. And that right there is just a full-stop stat. Credit due to the Tampa Bay Lightning, who were just a whole batch of warriors, but just could not get it done in the end. Nathan MacKinnon steps up, Arturi Lehkonen steps up, Cale Makar, and the rest of them, including guys like Nazem Kadri in the playoffs, in this series especially. They all answered the call. They answered the bell. I like to say that. And they really did prove to me that they are the toast of the NHL. And look, like I said, holding the Tampa Bay Lightning, even though they were without Point, even though they have that kind of track record and games played on them, mileage just racking up, it is still an impressive performance defensively from the Colorado Avalanche. One that I think was really the only weakness that anyone saw in their game was the defensive side of things. And they really did silence some critics there with the Game 6 performance against the Tampa Bay Lightning to hoist the Stanley Cup. Good to see Nas get the cup. Good to see MacKinnon get his cup. And we're going to talk about this right after the break is where do these two teams go from here? Very interesting makeups for both of these rosters. Like Steven Stamkos said after the game, I don't know why people are counting this team out because that core will be intact was basically the quote. And he's right. A lot of their top players are coming back. And when you have Andrei Vasilevsky, you're still in it no matter what. We're also going to talk about updated Stanley Cup odds after the break as well. But before I get there, I got to show some love to BetOnline, your number one source for your betting, sports info, and all of your betting needs. It is your continued source for all of your wagering info, live betting, esports, scores, and more, and it remains the best spot for all of your podcasts and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check on all of your favorite sports and events, including MMA, combat sports, boxing, and even golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and all the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you guys so much for making us your first listen every single day, even though it is just me today holding down the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Much love and a shout out to my co-host, Mr. Steele Roden, who will be back in the booth tomorrow. And while I have your listening attention and hopefully viewing attention, please make sure you head out there, drop us a review, drop us a subscribe. Let us know if you're feeling these picks, this content. Let us know so that we can get better every single day. That's what we're about. So much love for all of that. Now, I mentioned updated Stanley Cup odds. I'm going to get to that around the break. But what I want to talk about next is where do these two teams go from here, realistically? Because what I was talking about in terms of Steven Stamkos' comments from after the game, I think hold true. I think the Tampa Bay Lightning, despite the Eastern Conference really starting to look like the toast of both conferences, let's get it very out there in the open about where the talent lies. It seems to be the Eastern Conference going beast mode the past year or two at least. So Tampa Bay might be in tough to go to their 4th straight Stanley Cup, but I think they have just as good a shot as anybody. all those key players, for the most part, returning. A quick glance at some of their, UFAs: Andre Palat, Nick Paul, Jan Ruta, and Brian Elliott. Those are the UFAs on the list for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Those are all very, very manageable contracts. Let's see what happens, because I really do think the Tampa Bay Lightning have all kinds of opportunity to run it back, to make another run at the Stanley Cup, because they are so well coached. They have a great blue line, lots of forward depth, even if they do lose guys like Andre Palat and Nick Paul to free agency, which they might have to, because somebody is going to throw some money at Andre Palat, that's for sure, after another great season from him, another especially good postseason from him. But the Tampa Bay Lightning have all the pieces in place, including a solid front office and a solid crew of hockey minds behind the bench. I love me some John Cooper action. So let's see what happens there, because when you turn the tables and take a look at Colorado, things in Colorado are a lot more interesting in terms of what happens in the offseason. Joe Sakic has a lot of work to do, and I can very quickly ream off the list of pretty key unrestricted free agents: Andre Burakovsky, Andrew Cogliano, Darren Helm, Nazem Kadri, Valerie Nishishkin, Jack Johnson, Josh Manson, Ryan Murray, not as big there, but also Darcy Kemper. There are a lot of question marks here. And don't get me wrong, Mikko Rantanen, Gabriel Landeskog, Nathan McKinnon, even younger players like Alex Newhook still under contract. But look, even a guy like Arturi Lehkonen is an RFA. There is a lot of work for Joe Sakic here to do. And I know the talent still lies in Cale Makar, Nathan McKinnon, Gabriel Landeskog, and the others that I just mentioned. But this is the NHL, and teams are getting better every single year. This is now the team with the target on its back. Aside from the Tampa Bay Lightning, they are clearly the toast of the NHL. And teams are going to be finding ways in this offseason to load up their rosters and find ways to beat them. We know the Colorado Avalanche dominated the takeaway giveaway numbers in this series. A quick look at Game 6's numbers. Only 9 giveaways for the Colorado Avalanche to 18 for the Tampa Bay Lightning. So these kinds of numbers we know will matter next season, and these RFAs will obviously impact both teams' ability to be quality, but especially the Colorado Avalanche with the names of the players that I just reamed off. Look, this summer is going to be interesting for a whole number of reasons. Obviously, keep it tuned right here to the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast for us to break it all down for you every single week, especially in the ramp up to your fantasy drafts. Trust me when I say this is the hub for everything that you're going to need to know. Steele and I will be reaming off mock drafts, X factors, sleepers, all of the tidbits that you need to stack that fantasy paper come September and October. But another one of those interesting facts is how some of these teams are going to navigate the free agency. Joe Sakic said after the cup was lifted that he's going to take a day or two to enjoy himself and then see what he can do about this roster. Because realistically, most of the Tampa Bay Lightning core remains intact. Yes, those major pieces of the Colorado Avalanche remain intact, but some of those, some of those secondary pieces, some of those tertiary pieces are going to be hard for the Colorado Avalanche to bring back. So let's see what happens. You also have Boone Byron coming up next season as an RFA as well. There is some interesting maneuvering to happen here for Joe Sakic. Thank you so much, guys, for tuning in and making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day, Monday to Friday. You know where to find your hot hockey fantasy content, betting, breakdowns, predictions, and more. It is right here on the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. So thank you so much for all of that love and support. It really means the world to both Steele and I. Now, Stanley Cup 2023. I know we are just on the heels of lifting it in 2022, but this is what we do on this show. We talk betting, odds, and picks. But right before we get to that, I just want to mention a couple of very, very impressive numbers from the Colorado Avalanche. The number one being the Avs are just the 4th team in the NHL's entire history to clinch all 4 series on the road. They are also the first team with 10 comeback wins in a single postseason, and they are also the first team in NHL history to record a comeback victory in all series clinching winning games. All of those are all kinds of impressive. The whole series was a beauty performance from the Colorado Avalanche, and I just wanted to give that credit due because also, can Cale Makar continue to get better? Norris Trophy, Conn Smythe Trophy, and the Stanley Cup Trophy at 23 years old. We've talked a lot about Cale Makar, but I don't think the words can do this kid's performance justice. Because when I look at these updated odds and I look at how good Cale Makar was, it really doesn't make too much of any kind of surprise that the Colorado Avalanche sit again as the 2023 Cup favorites at plus 450. With Cale Makar looking how he did, these guys deserved return back-to-back Cup favorites, Vegas odds-wise. That's for sure. They were the favorites basically the whole way through this season. And take a look. They earned it. And looking at this list, guys, they deserve to be right at the top again. Let's get that right out in the open and clear. Plus 450 for the Colorado Avalanche heading into next season. To me, I think that number is juicy as well. I think it could even be lower with how good they are. Question marks abound for some of those key pieces in the roster, that's for sure. But I see enough in that roster on what's for sure going to be there to put them right there in that mix. And, looking down it a little bit, and yes, I'm going to point out a couple of spots for the value, but, the Carolina Hurricanes at plus 1,100 for sure. New York Rangers at plus 1,600 for sure. I talked a lot about it last year, but the Edmonton Oilers, if they can have a good offseason, and boy, that can be a big question mark for sure, especially out west, plus 1,900 for the Edmonton Oilers after seeing how good Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl were. If they can find a goalie on the open market, and I know that is a big if they can find a goaltender on the open market, the Edmonton Oilers at plus 1,900 definitely deserve a look. Because, and let me throw one more impressive stat out there. McDavid hasn't played, going into last night, McDavid hadn't played a hockey game in almost a month. And he was still, a month is a stretch. You know me with the numbers. Let's call it 20 days since playing a game. And he still had 5 or 6 more points than anyone else left in the playoffs. If the Edmonton Oilers can have any kind of a decent offseason, I'm telling you, that plus 1,900 is going to be a very, very valuable bet. Sprinkle a 10, 15, or even 20 wager on that bad boy and just watch the cash out increase. This is what we do on this show. We take a look at value, we take a look at lots of odds, and we take a look at bets, guys. And thank you so much for constantly tuning in over the ride that was the entire NHL season. Steele and I have just started kicking this show into high gear. We have all kinds of plans for the playoffs, including, like I mentioned, mock drafts and everything that you're going to need to make sure you are picking the right guys. Come your fantasy draft season, we saw Brisebois, Sakic, 2 real-life GMs architecturally build 2 beautifully ground-up teams. The Colorado Avalanche are only a few years removed from the very bottom of the NHL. This is how winners are built. And yes, like Gabriel Landeskog said post-game, you got to get some Cale Makars to make your team this good. And yes, that needs to happen. But take a look at what proper drafting and scouting can do for you, because now there's a banner in the rafters for the Colorado Avalanche. And like I said, these updated Stanley Cup odds point to the Colorado Avalanche plus 450 as the favorite. Tampa Bay Lightning plus 900 as the second favorite. You have the Toronto Maple Leafs for some reason in there at plus 900 right along with the Tampa Bay Lightning, even though they don't really know who's going to be playing in net. That's interesting as well. But if I was going to throw you one more value pick, little bit off the board, but a valuable one, the Nashville Predators at plus 6,000. If they can get a player in the offseason, I've heard Brent Burns rumors to the Nashville Predators. If they can make a piece, and I know ifs and buts abound here, but plus 6,000 for the Nashville Predators is definitely worth a look. Edmonton Oilers at plus 1,900, definitely worth a look. And if you're going into the top tier of odds, I'm probably looking right at the Carolina Hurricanes and New York Rangers. Hurricanes at plus 1,100 and Rangers at plus 1,600. That's where I see some value. Of course, the Colorado Avalanche are the favorite for the Stanley Cup again for good reason. But guys, trust me when I say so much more content, so much more hockey betting breakdown and fantasy analysis. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. I am Big Flip Livingstone, holding it down for my co-host Steele Roden on today's episode. We will see you back here again tomorrow for Wednesday's episode. And thank you so much for being here, guys. Have a great night, and let's get this paper.